Story 1. The Watcher in the Woods. It was a cold, moonless night when Sarah decided to visit her family's old farmhouse one last time. The house had been abandoned for years, left to rot as nature slowly reclaimed it. Sarah's parents had passed away years ago, and the property had been left to her and her brother. They had talked about selling it, but Sarah wanted to see it one last time before making any decisions. The farmhouse was nestled deep in the woods, far from any main roads. As Sarah drove down the narrow, winding path, the trees loomed overhead like dark sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. The headlights of her car barely cut through the darkness, making the journey feel even more ominous. She hadn't been to the farmhouse in years, and as she pulled up to the old structure, she felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease. The house stood as she remembered it, though more dilapidated. The windows were cracked, and the paint had long since peeled away. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. Sarah parked her car and sat for a moment, staring at the house, trying to muster the courage to go inside. Finally, she stepped out of the car, the crisp air biting at her skin. She grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and headed toward the house. The leaves crunched underfoot as she walked, the sound echoing through the silent woods. When she reached the porch, she hesitated, her hand resting on the doorknob. Something didn't feel right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Pushing the door open, Sarah stepped inside. The interior was just as she remembered, though everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. The furniture was still in place, and the old wooden floors creaked under her weight. She turned on her flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, making the house feel even more unsettling. She moved through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The memories of her childhood flooded back as she explored each room, but they were tinged with a sense of dread. The house felt different now, as if something sinister had taken residence there. As she entered the living room, she heard a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps on gravel. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness, and listened. The footsteps continued, slowly circling the house. She could hear them crunching on the gravel outside, moving closer to the windows. Panic set in. Sarah backed away from the window, her breath quickening. She didn't want to believe someone was out there, but the sound was undeniable. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. The farmhouse was too isolated. Then the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying. Sarah stood still, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. The house was deathly quiet. She slowly moved toward the window, peeking through the curtains. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and she could see nothing. Just as she was about to turn away, a flash of movement caught her eye. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just barely visible in the dim light. They were staring directly at the house, unmoving. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the figure was wearing a mask, a grotesque, distorted face that made her skin crawl. The figure took a step forward, then another, slowly approaching the house. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to get out, but the figure was between her and the car. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the back door. Maybe she could slip out and make a run for it. She crept toward the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. Just as she reached for the doorknob, she heard a loud bang from the front of the house. The door had slammed shut. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she realized the figure was now inside. She quickly locked the back door and looked around for a weapon. Her eyes landed on an old, heavy iron poker by the fireplace. She grabbed it, holding it tightly as she backed away from the door. She heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway. The figure was getting closer. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She couldn't hide. The house was too small, and the figure would find her. Her only option was to fight. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room. Sarah held her breath, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles turned white. The doorknob slowly turned, and the door creaked open. The figure stood in the doorway, the mask gleaming in the faint light from the window. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the figure lunged at her. Sarah swung the poker with all her strength, the iron connecting with a sickening thud. The figure stumbled back, but didn't go down. They recovered quickly, charging at her again. Sarah swung again, but this time the figure grabbed the poker, yanking it from her hands. Sarah stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The figure loomed over her, the grotesque mask filling her vision. She scrambled back, trying to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The figure reached down, grabbing her by the arm, their grip like a vice. Just as the figure pulled her up, there was another loud bang from outside. The figure froze, their heads snapping toward the window. Sarah didn't waste a second. She kicked out, catching the figure off guard, and broke free. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the front door. She threw open the door and ran outside, not daring to look back. The woods closed in around her as she sprinted toward the car. She could hear the figure behind her, their footsteps pounding on the gravel. She reached the car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, she managed to unlock the door and jumped inside. She slammed the door shut and locked it, just as the figure reached the car. They pounded on the window, the mask pressed against the glass. Sarah started the car, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the wheel. She floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the gravel before finally catching. The car shot forward, and Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the middle of the road, watching her as she sped away. The mask seemed to glow in the darkness, a haunting reminder of the terror she had just escaped. Sarah didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town. She pulled into a gas station and sat in the car, her hands still shaking. She knew she would never return to the farmhouse, not after what had happened. But even as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Story 2. The Haunting of Crestview Inn. Samantha had always loved old buildings, so when she found a small inn on the outskirts of a quaint village, she couldn't resist booking a weekend stay. Crestview Inn was a charming place, with its ivy-covered walls and antique furnishings. It was the perfect escape from her hectic life in the city. The innkeeper, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, welcomed her warmly, giving her the keys to a cozy room on the second floor. "This place has a lot of history," Mrs. Hawthorne said as she led Samantha to her room. "Built in the early 1800s, you know." "It's been in my family for generations," Samantha smiled, admiring the vintage decor as they walked down the creaky hallway. "It's beautiful. I can't wait to explore. Just be careful at night," Mrs. Hawthorne added with a serious tone. "Some of our guests have reported strange occurrences." Samantha's curiosity piqued. "Strange occurrences? Like what?" Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated for a moment before answering. "Whispers in the walls, objects moving on their own, shadows where there shouldn't be any. But I'm sure it's just the old building settling." Samantha nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. She was no stranger to ghost stories, but hearing about them in an actual old inn made it feel a little too real. After settling into her room, Samantha decided to take a walk around the inn. The halls were lined with old portraits and dusty chandeliers, giving the place an eerie, timeless quality. She wandered down to the ground floor, exploring the sitting rooms and the small library. The air was thick with the scent of old books and polished wood. As evening fell, Samantha returned to her room. She was excited to spend the night in such a historic place, though Mrs. Hawthorne's warning lingered in the back of her mind. She settled into the plush armchair by the window, reading a book she had brought along. The night was quiet, with only the occasional creak of the old building breaking the silence. But as the hours passed, Samantha began to notice something strange. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move in unnatural ways. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Then she heard a faint whispering sound, barely audible, coming from the walls. Samantha froze, her heart racing. She strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but the whispers were too soft, too distorted. She put down her book and stood up, walking slowly toward the wall. The whispering grew louder as she approached, but she still couldn't understand what was being said. She pressed her ear against the wall, and the whispers seemed to surround her, as if they were coming from all directions. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door, startling Samantha so badly she nearly jumped out of her skin. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The knocking came again, this time more insistent. She took a deep breath and walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, half expecting to see a ghostly figure standing on the other side. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, silent except for the soft creaking of the floorboards. Samantha stepped out of her room, looking both ways down the corridor, but there was no sign of anyone. A cold draft blew through the hallway, making her shiver. She turned to go back into her room, but just as she reached for the doorknob, she heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was louder, more distinct, as if it were right next to her. Samantha's blood ran cold. The whispers were no longer just soft, indistinct murmurs. They were voices, clear and insistent, though she still couldn't understand what they were saying. She backed away from the door, her heart racing. As she stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Samantha took a deep breath and hurried back into her room. Closing the door behind her, she locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm her racing heart. But the sense of unease only grew. She felt as though she were being watched, though there was no one else in the room. Samantha decided she couldn't stay in the room any longer. She grabbed her coat and headed downstairs, intending to find Mrs. Hawthorne and ask if anyone else had experienced something similar. But as she reached the ground floor, she realized the inn was completely silent. There were no other guests, no sign of the innkeeper. She walked through the sitting rooms, the library, even the kitchen, but there was no one there. The entire inn felt deserted, as if everyone had vanished into thin air, just as she was about to head back upstairs. She heard a noise coming from the basement. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. Samantha hesitated, every instinct telling her to leave the inn immediately. But something compelled her to find out what was going on. She found the door to the basement at the end of a narrow hallway. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out from below. Samantha took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the old hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, leading down into the darkness. Samantha descended slowly, her hand gripping the railing tightly. The air grew colder as she went deeper, the smell of damp earth and mildew filling her nostrils. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old shelves filled with dusty jars and bottles. In the center of the room was a large wooden table covered with a tattered cloth. Samantha's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where she saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was Mrs. Hawthorne, her back turned to Samantha as she muttered something under her breath. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" Samantha called out, her voice trembling. The old woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her head bowed as she continued to mutter. Samantha took a step closer, and the floor creaked underfoot. Mrs. Hawthorne's head snapped up, and she turned to face Samantha. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her face pale and gaunt. She looked like a different person, her kind demeanor replaced by something cold and menacing. "Leave this place," Mrs. Hawthorne hissed, her voice low and harsh. "You don't belong here." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. What's happening?" Mrs. Hawthorne took a step forward, her eyes locking onto Samantha's. "They're coming for you. They've been waiting for someone like you." Samantha backed away, her hands shaking. Who are they?" "The spirits," Mrs. Hawthorne whispered, her voice barely audible. "The spirits of those who never left. They're trapped here, and now they want you to join them." Samantha's blood ran cold. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. She could hear the whispers again, growing louder and more frantic as she reached the top. She didn't stop running until she reached the front door. She flung it open and ran out into the night, not daring to look back. The cold air bit at her skin as she sprinted to her car, her heart pounding in her ears. She fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and climb inside. She started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, the tires spinning on the gravel. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The inn loomed in the distance, its dark windows watching her as she drove away. The whispers still echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the terror she had narrowly escaped. She knew she would never return to Crestview Inn, but the memory of that night would haunt her forever. Story 3. The Curse of Black Hollow Woods. Ethan had always been an adventurer. He loved exploring the outdoors, finding hidden trails, and camping in remote places. So when he heard about Black Hollow Woods, a dense forest with a dark reputation, he knew he had to see it for himself. The locals told stories about the woods, how people who entered sometimes never came back, how strange lights were seen flickering among the trees at night, and how eerie whispers could be heard in the wind. But Ethan wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He packed his gear and set out on a crisp autumn morning, determined to spend the weekend exploring the mysterious forest. As he drove closer, the trees grew taller and the sunlight dimmed, casting long shadows on the winding road. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the silence. When Ethan reached the edge of the woods, he parked his car and grabbed his backpack. The entrance to the forest was marked by an old, weathered sign that read, "Black Hollow Woods, enter at your own risk." Ethan chuckled to himself, shaking off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. He was here for an adventure, not to be scared by old legends. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The path was narrow and overgrown, but Ethan had no trouble finding his way. He hiked for hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the wilderness. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. As the sun began to set, Ethan found a small clearing and decided to set up camp. He pitched his tent, built a small fire, and sat down to eat. The sky turned a deep orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, and soon the forest was shrouded in darkness. The fire crackled softly, providing the only light in the otherwise pitch-black night. Ethan leaned back against a log, feeling content. But as the night wore on, he started to notice something strange. The woods, which had been so peaceful during the day, seemed to come alive with the fall of darkness. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were shifting in the wind, though the air was still. The rustling of leaves grew louder, more frantic, and Ethan could swear he heard whispers carried on the breeze. He shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling of unease. It was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind, he told himself. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more distinct. Ethan sat up, straining to listen. The voices were low and eerie, like a chorus of murmurs surrounding him from all sides. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the whispers were not just random noises, they were speaking his name. Ethan. Ethan. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, looking around the clearing. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the trees. But there was no one there, only the dark, silent forest. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. The silence that followed was oppressive. As if the woods were holding their breath, Ethan grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the darkness, the beam cutting through the night. The light illuminated the gnarled trunks of the trees and the dense underbrush, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the sound. He turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the fear that had settled in his chest. But as he did, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The fire, which had been burning steadily, was now flickering and dimming, as if being smothered by an unseen force. Panic set in as Ethan frantically tried to stoke the flames, but no matter what he did, the fire continued to die. The darkness pressed in around him, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Ethan, you shouldn't have come here." He spun around, shining the flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing, only the trees and the darkness. The fear that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind now consumed him entirely. He grabbed his backpack and started to pack up his gear, his hands shaking. "I need to get out of here," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. But as he turned to leave, he froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at him with eyes that gleamed like polished stones in the darkness. Ethan backed away, his heart racing. The figure took another step forward, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The words were no longer just whispers, they were a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, filling the air with a cacophony of sound. "Leave. Leave now." Ethan turned and ran, his footsteps pounding on the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in around him, the branches reaching out like twisted hands. The path that had been so clear during the day was now lost in the darkness, and Ethan found himself stumbling through the underbrush, the whispers following him, growing louder and louder. He didn't stop running until he burst out of the woods and onto the road. His car was just ahead, and he sprinted toward it, his lungs burning. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the door. Finally, he managed to get it open and jumped inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He started the engine and floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as he sped away. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching him with those gleaming eyes. The whispers still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of what he had encountered in Black Hollow Woods. Ethan didn't stop driving until he reached the safety of his home. But even then, the fear didn't leave him. The memory of the figure, the whispers, and the suffocating darkness stayed with him, haunting his every thought. He knew he had narrowly escaped something terrible that night, and he vowed never to return to Black Hollow Woods. But the whispers had followed him home, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape them. They filled his dreams, his waking moments, a constant reminder that he had ventured where he didn't belong. And he knew, deep down, that they were waiting for him to return, to claim what he had left behind in those cursed woods. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.